The sun rose over the Gulf of Patras on the morning of October 7th in the year 1571, revealing a sea crowded with wooden leviathans. The water rippled gently against the hulls of nearly 600 galley ships as they maneuvered into battle formation. Oars splashed in rhythmic unison while thousands of men checked their weapons and whispered final prayers. The air felt heavy with the scent of salt and the impending smoke of gunpowder. This was not merely a skirmish over trade routes or territory, but a collision of civilizations that would decide the future of the Mediterranean. The silence before the first cannon fired was deafening and filled with dread. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had expanded westward with an unstoppable momentum that terrified the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Their fleets dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and their armies seemed invincible on land and sea alike. The fall of Cyprus earlier that year had sent shockwaves through Venice and Rome, confirming that no coast was safe from invasion. Pope Pius V understood that a divided Europe could not withstand the organized might of the Sultan. If the Ottoman fleet broke through these waters, Italy, and perhaps all of Christendom, would lie open to conquest. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of the Western world and its cultural identity. Venice was the power most directly threatened by the Ottoman naval expansion, and their economy relied heavily on maritime trade routes. The Venetian Senate pleaded for assistance from the other European powers, but old rivalries made cooperation difficult. Spain was concerned with rebellions in the Netherlands and pirates in North Africa, while France maintained a controversial alliance with the Sultan. It took the tireless diplomacy of the Pope to bridge these divides and forge a coalition. He called for a holy league to defend the faith and the freedom of the seas. It was a fragile alliance held together by necessity and the looming shadow of the Crescent Banner. The man chosen to lead this massive and disparate force was Don John of Austria, the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. Despite his youth, he possessed a natural charisma and a burning desire for military glory that inspired loyalty in his men. He was tasked with uniting proud Venetian admirals, Spanish generals, and papal knights under a single command. His appointment was a gamble, but his energy and decisive nature proved to be exactly what the Holy League needed. Don John viewed this campaign not just as a military duty, but as a divine mission to drive back the Ottoman advance. On the opposing side stood Ali Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, who was a seasoned commander respected for his tactical mind and personal bravery. He commanded a force that was numerically superior and brimming with confidence from years of unbroken victories. Ali Pasha carried with him a massive green banner embroidered with verses from the Quran, which had been a gift from Mecca. He believed that destiny was on the side of the Ottoman Empire and that the Christian fleet would crumble before the might of his galleys. He was eager to crush the Holy League before they could gain any momentum. The two massive armadas had spent the summer circling each other in a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Intelligence reports filtered in, slowly causing anxiety and second-guessing among the commanders on both sides. The Holy League gathered its strength at the port of Messina in Sicily, where Don John worked tirelessly to organize supplies and smooth over disputes between the Spanish and Venetians. It was a logistical nightmare to feed and equip tens of thousands of soldiers and rowers. Yet by late September, the fleet was ready to sail east to seek out the enemy and force a decisive engagement. As the Holy League sailed toward the Gulf of Patras, they brought with them a secret weapon that the Ottomans had never encountered in such numbers. The Venetians had converted 6 massive merchant transport ships into floating fortresses known as galleasses. These ships were higher and wider than standard galleys and bristled with heavy artillery on all sides. They were slow and difficult to maneuver, but their firepower was devastating. Don John planned to place these giants at the front of his battle line to break the enemy formation before the lighter galleys made contact. It was a bold, tactical innovation. The Ottoman fleet was anchored at Lepanto, a fortified port inside the Gulf where they had stopped to resupply and rest their rowers. Ali Pasha received word of the approaching Christian fleet and held a council of war with his captains. Some of his advisors suggested remaining under the protection of the fortress guns, but Ali Pasha was under orders from Sultan Selim II to engage the enemy. His pride in the explicit commands from Constantinople drove him to sail out and meet the Holy Leg in open water. He ordered his ships to form a crescent formation that would allow him to envelop the Christian line. On the morning of the battle, the wind favored the Ottomans, blowing from the east and driving them toward the Holy Leg. This gave Ali Pasha the initial advantage, as his ships could use their sails to close the distance, while the Christians had to row against the wind. However, as the fleets drew closer, the wind miraculously shifted to the west. The Ottoman sails went limp and their momentum stalled, while the Holy Leg found the wind at their backs. A cheer went up from the Christian ships as they interpreted this meteorological twist as a sign of divine favor. The battle line of the Holy League stretched for miles from north to south, divided into 3 main squadrons and a reserve force. The left wing was commanded by the Venetian Agostino Barbarigo, who hugged the coastline to prevent the enemy from outflanking him. The right wing was led by the Genoese Admiral Ginandrea Doria, who was wary of the open sea and the tactical skills of his opponent. In the center rode Don John of Austria aboard his flagship, the Real, surrounded by the most powerful galleys of Spain and the Papal States. The reserve force was commanded by the Marquis of Santa Cruz, ready to plug any gaps. Facing them, the Ottoman center was led by Ali Pasha aboard his flagship, the Sultana, which was directly opposite the Real. The Ottoman right wing was commanded by maimed Sirocco, who knew the local waters intimately and planned to use the shoals to his advantage. The Ottoman left wing was under the command of Ulugh Ali, a brilliant corsair and admiral who was perhaps the most dangerous tactician in the Ottoman fleet. The stage was set for the largest naval battle in history, involving more than 400 ships and over 100,000 fighting men. As the Ottoman fleet advanced, they were met by the thunderous roar of the 6 Venetian galleasses stationed in the vanguard. The heavy cannons of these floating fortresses tore through the wooden hulls of the approaching galleys with terrifying ease. Cannonballs smashed through banks of oars and shattered masts, disrupting the Ottoman formation before they could even return fire. The galleasses acted as breakwaters, splitting the Ottoman line and forcing their ships to scatter to avoid the deadly barrage. This initial shock confused the Ottoman captains and blunted the force of their opening charge. Despite the damage inflicted by the galleasses, the Ottoman fleet pressed forward, driven by the shouts of their officers and the beat of drums. The two lines collided with a sickening crunch of timber as galley rams smashed into opposing ships. The sea instantly turned into a chaotic melee of grappling hooks and musketry. This was not a battle of long-range artillery, but a series of brutal infantry clashes fought on floating platforms. Soldiers leaped from deck to deck, engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat with swords and pikes. On the northern flank closer to the coast, the fighting was particularly savage between the Venetian forces and the ships of Sirocco. The Ottoman commander attempted to slip between the Venetian line and the shore to surround them. Agostino Barbarigo reacted quickly, pivoting his ships to block the maneuver, but the fighting was intense. Arrows and musket balls filled the air like swarms of angry hornets. Barbarigo lifted the visor of his helmet to shout orders and was struck in the eye by an arrow. Though mortally wounded, he continued to command his men until the line was secure. In the center of the battle, the two flagships sought each other out like duelists in a crowded arena. The Real and the Sultana crashed together and were instantly locked in a deadly embrace. The elite Spanish infantry known as the tercios surged forward to board the Ottoman flagship, while the janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, fought back with equal ferocity. The decks became slippery with blood as wave after wave of reinforcements from nearby galleys fed into the grinder. It was a contest of sheer will between the two supreme commanders. Don John of Austria stood on the quarterdeck of the Real, sword in hand, directing the assault with a calm demeanor that belied the chaos around him. He wore brilliant armor that reflected the sun, making him a visible beacon for his men. Beside him, young noblemen from across Europe fought to prove their valor. The fighting on the Sultana seesawed back and forth. Twice the Spanish troops reached the mainmast of the Ottoman flagship, only to be driven back by a counterattack of janissaries wielding scimitars and arquebuses. To the south, the battle took a different and dangerous turn as Ulugh Ali attempted a complex maneuver to outflank the Christian right wing. Ginandria Doria, seeing the Ottoman movement, extended his line further south to prevent being encircled. This created a dangerous gap between the Christian center and the right wing. Ulugh Ali, seeing the opening he had created, suddenly turned his ships inward and struck hard at the exposed flank of the Christian center. It was a brilliant tactical move that threatened to unravel the entire Holy Leg formation. Several galleys of the Knights of Malta, which were stationed near the gap, found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden Ottoman onslaught. The flagship of the Knights was boarded, and its crew fought to the last man against overwhelming odds. Ulugh Ali captured the banner of the Knights and seemed poised to roll up the Christian line from the side. Panic began to spread among the nearby ships as the Ottoman corsairs pressed their advantage. The fate of the battle hung in the balance in this southern sector. However, the Holy League had a reserve force commanded by the Marquis of Santa Cruz, who had been watching the battle unfold with an eagle eye. Seeing the crisis developing on the right flank, he immediately ordered his squadron to advance. The reserve galleys smashed into the Ottoman ships that were attacking the Knights of Malta. This timely intervention caught Ulugh Ali by surprise and halted his momentum. The arrival of fresh Christian troops stabilized the line and turned the trap back on the Ottomans. Back in the center, the struggle for the Sultana reached its climax. Don John ordered a third and final assault on the Ottoman flagship. This time, the Spanish infantry managed to kill the Ottoman commander Ali Pasha. His death was the turning point of the entire engagement. When the Ottoman soldiers saw the head of their admiral raised on a pike, their morale collapsed. The banner of the Sultan was lowered, and the banner of the Holy League was raised high above the smoke. The news of Ali Pasha's death spread like wildfire across the water, causing panic among the remaining Ottoman ships in the center. Galleys that had been fighting stubbornly suddenly turned to flee or surrendered. The cohesive fighting force of the Ottoman Empire began to disintegrate into isolated pockets of resistance. Don John pressed the advantage, ordering his captains to pursue the retreating enemy and secure the prizes. The water was thick with wreckage and men swimming for their lives. On the northern flank, the Venetians had finally overcome the forces of Sirocco. The Ottoman commander was captured and killed, and his ships were driven onto the shore or sunk. The Venetian sailors, fueled by vengeance for the loss of Cyprus, fought with a terrible fury, giving no quarter to the enemy. The entire Ottoman right wing had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The victory in the north, combined with the breakthrough in the center, signaled the total defeat of the Ottoman fleet. Only in the south did a portion of the Ottoman fleet manage to escape. Ulugh Ali, realizing that the battle was lost, gathered what ships he could and made a run for the open sea. He managed to save about 40 galleys and the captured banner of the Knights of Malta. His escape was the only blemish on an otherwise total victory for the Holy Leg. Don John considered pursuing him, but the approaching storm and the need to secure the captured ships made it impossible. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened and a storm began to brew over the Gulf of Patras. The sea, which had been relatively calm, turned choppy, adding to the difficulty of the rescue operations. Thousands of Christian slaves who had been chained to the oars of the Ottoman galleys were liberated. Their chains were struck off and they were given weapons to join their liberators. The joy of these men, who had suffered years of captivity, was one of the most moving scenes of the day. The scale of the victory was staggering. The Holy League had captured or destroyed over 200 Ottoman ships, while losing only a dozen of their own. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers and sailors had been killed or captured, breaking the myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea. The Holy League had suffered heavy casualties as well, with thousands of dead and wounded, but the threat of an immediate invasion of Italy had been extinguished. The Mediterranean was no longer an Ottoman lake. Among the wounded on the Christian side was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes. He had fought bravely despite suffering from a fever and had been shot 3 times, once in the chest and twice in the left hand. He would lose the use of his hand forever, but he would later write that he considered his wounds a badge of honor. He famously described the battle as the most noble and memorable event that past centuries have seen. His literary legacy would eventually outshine even the generals who commanded that day. The victors gathered their prizes, and the wounded sailed for the port of Patala to seek shelter from the worsening storm. The sea was left to the dead and the wreckage of a once mighty fleet. The magnitude of what had been achieved began to sink in among the commanders. For the first time in a century, a major Ottoman force had been decisively defeated. The psychological barrier that had paralyzed Christian Europe was shattered. News of the victory traveled slowly by the standards of the modern world, but when it arrived, it sparked jubilant celebrations. In Venice, the news was announced in St. Mark's Square, and the city erupted in festivities that lasted for days. In Rome, Pope Pius V was said to have had a vision of the victory at the very hour it occurred. He declared a feast day and led processions of thanks through the streets. The bells of churches rang out across Europe from Madrid to Vienna. Despite the crushing tactical victory, the Holy League failed to fully exploit their strategic advantage. The onset of winter and the perennial disagreements between the allies prevented them from sailing on to retake Cyprus or attack Constantinople. The alliance began to fracture almost as soon as the battle was won. Venice eventually signed a separate peace treaty with the Ottomans, and Spain turned its attention back to the Netherlands. The unity of Lepanto was a fleeting moment in history. The Ottoman Empire, though defeated, proved resilient. Under the guidance of the Grand Vizier and the surviving Admiral Ulugh Ali, they rebuilt their fleet with astonishing speed. Within a year, the Ottomans had a new navy that rivaled the one lost at Lepanto. They maintained control of the eastern Mediterranean, and Cyprus remained in their hands for centuries. Strategically, the map of the Mediterranean did not change drastically after the battle. However, the true significance of Lepanto was not in territory gained, but in the morale of the West. It halted the momentum of Ottoman expansion and proved that the Sultan could be beaten. It ended the fear of an imminent Islamic conquest of Rome and Western Europe. The battle marked the beginning of a long decline in Ottoman naval supremacy, even if it was not immediately apparent. It was a psychological turning point that preserved the cultural independence of Europe. The Battle of Lepanto remains one of the last great engagements of the Age of Galleys. It was a battle fought with technologies that were becoming obsolete as the age of sail and heavy broadside artillery began to dawn. The sheer number of men engaged in hand-to-hand combat on the open sea would never be seen again on such a scale. It was the end of an era in naval warfare and the closing chapter of the medieval style of crusading conflict. Today, the legacy of Lepanto is remembered in art, literature, and religious observances. Paintings by Titian and Veronese commemorate the victory, and the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary was established to give thanks for the intercession believed to have saved Christendom. The battle stands as a testament to what can be achieved when divided nations unite against a common existential threat. It is a story of courage, faith, and the unpredictable tides of history. Don John of Austria became the hero of the hour, celebrated in every court in Europe. His youthful ambition had been realized, and his name was spoken with reverence. Yet he would die young just 7 years later, without ever achieving the kingdom he so desired. His moment of glory at Lepanto was the pinnacle of his life, a brief shining instant where he held the fate of the world in his hands. He remains the eternal golden knight of the 16th century. The waters of the Gulf of Patras are quiet now, showing no sign of the carnage that once stained them red. The wooden galleys have long since rotted away, and the empires that fought there have crumbled into dust. But the echoes of that October day still resonate in the history books and the collective memory of the West. It was a day when the course of history turned on the bravery of men and the shifting of the wind. Lepanto was truly the battle that saved the West.